This video lecture is on books 2 and 3 of Plato's Republic. So, we saw at the end of book 1, it ended with Thrasymachus basically agreeing with Socrates. And yet, Glaucon is not so convinced. In many ways, the first book is not necessarily a condensed version of the entirety of the Republic, but certainly it sets the ground, it sets the stage for everything to be discussed in the Republic overall. So, Socrates argued that the just person's soul is in a better condition than the unjust, which will make them happier. We can think of book 1 as kind of the shorter way to educating someone to be just. Perhaps Thrasymachus is satisfied since he seems to agree with Socrates. I say seems, but he also doesn't say anything else the rest of the Republic, which is really interesting because of that discussion about appearances, where someone might appear good but they could be bad, or they might appear good and be good, or appear bad but really be good. Could Thrasymachus actually have a good soul and it's a front? It's not quite clear. But it definitely seems like the others, at least, are not really convinced or satisfied. Why might that be? And why, in terms of, what needs to be done to convince them to be just? That it is good to be just, that they ought to desire to become just. If that's the short way, then the entirety of the Republic is the long way. It involves the dialectic. But more than just the dialectic that we can think of in a conversation, kind of in the Socratic method of questioning back and forth, the dialectic is this unfolding, all-encompassing activity with all the characters, but also the reader. For the dialectic to be successful, right? This book is not just about, trying to convince Glaucon and Adeimantus why they should be just. It's about the reader as well. For the dialectic to work, the reader is actually part of the philosophical conversation. The truth of the Republic is only discerned by the philosophical participant. And I think William Altman in his book Plato the Teacher explains this really well. He says, Plato deploys the basinistic element for a triple purpose. A, to ensure that the student has grasped his visionary teaching. B, to cause that teaching to leap from the text into the mind of the student. So the student kind of grasps some of the text, the main arguments, what the dialogue is about, how it proceeds. But the reader, in so doing, is then taking it outside of the text, and in a way, through their understanding, carrying the text beyond itself. And thus, C, to point the student to something even greater than what the teacher has already taught. So we'll see how that unfolds throughout the rest of the Republic. Socrates says there are 3 forms of the good that can be considered. There's a good for its own sake, where we say something has intrinsic worth, or it's intrinsically valuable. It's good for its own sake, not because of its consequences. The second form, a good for its own sake and its consequences. So this is what he, of course, tried to say about why it's good to be just, because one is going to be happy, and they're going to get good consequences from being happy. But also that justice is a good for its own sake as well. There's a reason that even if you aren't necessarily happy, it could also be a good. And the third form is a good for consequences only. This is the kind of consideration that we can see from perhaps Polemarchus, the idea of justice is giving what one is owed, so the consequence of receiving things you're owed, meritoriously. Thrasymachus, justice is the advantage of the stronger. It's just as the advantage, the stronger receives that advantage, that good, that is an advantage. So we can see a kind of consequentialist take, or say that a good is it's only externally good, right? For some external reasons outside of itself. What Socrates wants to do is convince the participants in the dialogue that it is that a good is for its own sake, mainly justice, is a good for its own sake and its consequences. Why? Why does Socrates not say that actually justice is a good just for its own sake? Why does he take that middle ground, that it's both a good for its own sake and its consequences? Okay, so they consider what Socrates calls the opinion of the many. And the many, we can think of this as kind of like the hive mind of Athens, of Grecians, the kind of like common thing that people believe unquestioningly. So basically, the opinion of the many is, it is best to never agree to be unjust to others. So it is best not to say, I think sometimes you should be unjust. Right? No. It's best to never agree to be unjust to others. But also, it is best to never suffer injustice. And what that means is that justice is a mean between doing injustice without being punished and suffering injustice without being able to avenge oneself. You should never. If it comes to suffering injustice without being able to avenge oneself, then you shouldn't be just, if that's what justice entails. And what this basically means is, you shouldn't outwardly be just to others. But it's actually just as bad or worse to have injustice suffered to oneself than to do injustice to others. And Socrates is concerned with that opinion because he thinks that what that sentiment really exposes is the shallowness of the concern for justice. That actually, we only care about not doing injustice to others because we don't want others to punish us, because we don't want to suffer, because we find our own suffering worse, first and foremost. So he brings up this myth called the Ring of Gyges. So he says that even those who practice it, justice, do so unwillingly from an incapacity to do injustice. We would best perceive, if we should in thought do something like this: give each, the just man and the unjust, license to do whatever he wants, while we follow and watch where his desire will lead each. Right? We want to see the consequences. Is it actually better to be just or unjust? So imagine we could, see this playing out. He says, we would catch the just man red-handed, going the same way as the unjust man, out of a desire to get the better. This is what any nature naturally pursues as good, while it is law which by force perverts it to honor equality. The license which I speak would be best realized if they should come into possession of the sort of power that it is said the ancestors of Gyges, the Lydian, once got. So the question is, what if the just person, the person who says, according to the form of, a thing, an object is good, if it's both a good in itself and for its consequences. But what if one were to never get caught doing an injustice? What is human nature? What would humans naturally do? Would they commit injustice or not? This is how the story of the Ring of Gyges goes. They say he was a shepherd, toiling in the service of the man who was then ruling Lydia. There came to pass a great thunderstorm and an earthquake. The earth cracked and a chasm opened at the place where he was pasturing. He saw it, wondered at it, and went down. He saw, along with other quite wonderful things about which they tell tales, a hollow bronze horse. It had windows. Peeping in, he saw there was a corpse inside that looked larger than human size. It had nothing on except a gold ring on its hand. He slipped it off and went out. So first, just imagine this, okay? Earthquake, this chasm opens up. This individual peers in. There's like some kind of almost like a big statue or something of a horse with windows in. And when he looks in, he's seeing a giant with a ring on, which turns out to be this Ring of Gyges. Why? Why is there this giant? It's just fascinating to think about. So he says, when there was the usual gathering, so he slipped the ring off the giant, took it with him, went out. When there was this usual gathering of the shepherds to make the monthly report to the king about the flocks, he too came wearing the ring. Now, while he was sitting with the others, he chanced to turn the collet of the ring to himself toward the inside of his hand. So he's just kind of sitting there, and he kind of, just sitting there, just bored, turns the ring. It turns out when he turns the collet toward his hand, he became invisible to those sitting by him, and they discussed him as though he were away. He wondered at this, and, fingering the ring again, he twisted the collet toward the outside. When he had twisted it, he became visible. Thinking this over, he tested whether the ring had this power, and that was exactly his result. When he turned the collet inward, he became invisible. When outward, visible. Aware of this, he immediately contrived to be one of the messengers to the king. When he arrived, he committed adultery with the king's wife, and, along with her, set upon the king and killed him. And so he took over the rule. So he says, now if there were two such rings, and the just man would put one on, and the unjust man the other, no one, as it would seem, would be so adamant as to stick by justice and bring himself to keep away from what belongs to others and not lay hold of it, although he had license to take what he wanted from the market without fear, and to go into houses and have intercourse with whomever he wanted, and to slay or release from bonds whomever he wanted, and to do other things as an equal to a god among humans. And in so doing, one would act no differently from the other, but both would go the same way. And yet, someone could say that this is a great proof that no one is willingly just, but only when compelled to do so. So he says, indeed, all men suppose that injustice is far more to their private profit than justice. I mean, think about, with examples of, people that do charity, and then they, take the pictures of them doing charity, and they, post it on Facebook, Would those people likely be doing that charity if they weren't documenting it for the world to see? Is there something about injustice that we almost seem to maybe do it for the sake of it, as well as actually the consequences, which are, if you're going to commit injustice in terms of stealing, right, gaining wealth and things like that. But yet when it comes to justice, most people would not do acts of justice or would not be just for its own sake, but because of the consequences that are brought to the one that is just, because people praise the person for being just. This is the very question Socrates is concerned with. This is the question he's bringing up, talking to Glaucon, Adeimantus, Polemarchus, and the rest, trying to figure out, on the one hand, what if this is the case, that naturally we are predisposed to prefer injustice if actually in private, if we did just deeds that, nobody actually knew, they weren't public, we wouldn't care to do it. So do we only care to be just because of the punishment that comes from being unjust? So consider a perfectly just person and a perfectly unjust person. The question is, throughout the course of their life, which of the two is happier? Okay. So Socrates says, What then is this opposition between the perfectly just and perfectly unjust person? Also, what might it mean to be a perfectly unjust person? We could think about that as well. Is that an oxymoron? It is as follows. We shall take away nothing from the injustice of the unjust man, nor from the justice of the just man, but we shall take each as perfect in his own pursuit. So first, let the unjust man act like the clever craftsman. An outstanding pilot or doctor is aware of the difference between what is impossible in his art and what is possible, and he attempts the one and lets the other go. And if, after all, he should still trip up in any way, he is competent to set himself aright. Similarly, let the unjust man Similarly, let the unjust man also attempt unjust deeds correctly and get away with them if he's going to be extremely unjust. The man who's caught must be considered a poor chap. For the extreme of injustice is to seem to be just when one is not. So the perfectly unjust man must be given the most perfect injustice, and nothing must be taken away. So basically, he would never be caught. That's what it means by perfect injustice. Those unjust deeds, he's so secretive and stealthy, he never gets caught. He must be allowed to do the greatest injustices while having provided himself with the greatest reputation for justice. So we have someone that's truly unjust yet appears just. And if, after all, he should trip up in anything, he has the power to set himself aright. If any of his unjust deeds should come to light, he is capable both of speaking persuasively and of using force to the extent that force is needed, since he is courageous and strong, and since he has provided for friends and money. Now let us set him down as such, and put beside him in the argument the just man in his turn, a man simple and noble, who, according to Aeschylus, does not wish to seem, but rather to be good. The seeming must be taken away. For if he should seem just, there would be honors and gifts for him for seeming to be such. Then it would be plain whether he is such for the sake of the just, or for the sake of the gifts and honors. So he must be stripped of everything except justice, and his situation must be made the opposite of the first man's. So if we want to compare side by side, which of the two ultimately is happier? The person who appears just but really is unjust, compared to the person who appears unjust but really actually is a just person. Doing no injustice. Let him have the greatest reputation for injustice, so that his justice may be put to the test to see if it is softened by bad reputation and its consequences. Let him go unchanged till death, seeming throughout life to be unjust, although he is just, so that when each has come to the extreme, the one of justice, the other of injustice, they can be judged as to which of the two is happier. It's pretty straightforward. Which of the two is happier? It's going to be the unjust person. At least that's how it appears. By all means of measurement, we're going to say the person that dies, that nobody ever knows was unjust, everybody thinks was just, they're going to, it appears, die the happier person. So why? What's the point of being just? If it doesn't seem like, there's anything intrinsically good to it. But the question they asked, they're going to continue asking this question, and Socrates is going to try to persuade everyone that actually, no, it is better to be just, even if you don't receive rewards for it. But at this moment, they pause, and they ask, okay, is this result that we admit, yes, the person who is perfectly unjust, but appears perfectly just, is going to be happier? People are going to prefer that life to the other life, where one basically lives miserably in society, but actually does just deeds, is a just person. Is this because it's natural, or is it due to society? Glaucon ends up actually imitating Thrasymachus, how Thrasymachus might respond to this. And he says, "For if all of you had spoken in this way from the beginning and persuaded us from youth onwards, we would not keep guard over each other for fear injustice be done. but each would be his own best guard, afraid that in doing injustice he would dwell with the greatest evil. So it seems that what Glaucon is trying to get at is, if one educates one from the very beginning that it is better to be just, then everyone will actually keep guard over themselves to be a just person. Because if it's admitted actually that everybody naturally does prefer injustice because they profit from it, well, if everyone knows that, it turns into a kind of Hobbesian state of nature of a war of all against all, where actually everybody wants to keep their guard up to prevent everyone else from committing injustice. So there's a kind of tension there in whether it's true or not that the perfectly unjust person is happier. But basically, Glaucon gives a demand. He says to Socrates, look, demonstrate what justice and injustice is and what it does to the person that possesses each. Not in appearance, like we were just considering, how it appears whether the two of them is happier, and not whether we suppose they are, but to give the truth, the real answer, as to whether the one is truly happier or not. So Glaucon is asking, or really he's demanding, tell me the nature of justice. What is the nature of the just individual? And once we know what the nature is, then we can actually determine the nature of justice and whether it is intrinsically good or not. So how does one go about determining what the nature of justice is? Socrates suggests what is known as the city-soul analogy. He says, well, we know it's easier to look for bigger things, than look for a needle in a haystack. So what we want to do is we want to actually ask, well, what is the just city? Because once we know what the just city is, then we'll know what the nature of justice is, and we'll be able to look for the individual to see what the nature of justice is in the individual to determine whether or not it's an intrinsic good to be just or not. So then, perhaps there would be more justice in the bigger, and it would be easier to observe closely, Socrates says. If you want, first we'll investigate what justice is like in the cities, then we'll also go on to consider it in individuals, considering the likeness of the bigger in the idea or the look of the littler. And there's some reason to suppose that the nature of the two is the same, or at least that this is possible in terms of how one investigates the nature of justice. Because if we think about what a just city consists in, it requires individuals who obey, who fully comply with the principles of justice. You're not going to have a just city where people don't comply with the principles of justice. So if you are able to determine what the nature of justice is in the city, then that necessarily means the individuals that inhabit the city are going to be just as well. So to see a city come into being is to see justice come into being. So they begin in logos, in constructing a city in speech solely. They begin with what is known as the city of pigs, or the city of necessity. Called the city of pigs because, as Glaucon says, it's a city fit for pigs. There's not a lot of pleasure in it. And Socrates says, well, consider the most self-sufficient, harmonious city. And he says it would consist of 4 or 5 men maximum. No one is completely self-sufficient in the city, because you have one profession each to provide for a community as a whole. But on this basis, he says, each thing comes to be more plentiful, finer, and easier when one man, exempt from other tasks, does one thing according to nature and at the crucial moment. So, is that true that actually if one person commits to try to excel in a single task, it's better as a whole that everybody do that than as compared to everybody trying to be good in many tasks? So the idea is, look, if you have someone who tries to flourish as a carpenter, one who tries to flourish as a farmer, and so on, then all of them work together to make the community self-sufficient, even though each individual is not self-sufficient without the other. But then Socrates says, in conversation with Glaucon, well, there might be some more things needed. We need more professions for tools who are going to be able to make different kinds of, more advanced tools that are going to help the carpenter and the farmer and so on. This means we're going to likely need imports, so we're going to need trade. And what accompanies trade? Merchants. If you're going to have merchants, you're going to need currency. You can't, import goods without being able to pay for them. So then you're going to need tradesmen who are going to be able to make these tools. These tradesmen are going to need to employ wage earners. So now the city has kind of exploded from the bare minimum of the city of necessity. But Socrates still says this is the kind of life led in the smallest, most self-sufficient city, the city of necessity. So he says, perhaps what you say is fine. It really must be considered, and we mustn't back away. First, let's consider what manner of life men so provided will lead. Won't they make bread, wine, clothing, and shoes? And when they have built houses, they will work in the summer, for the most part naked and without shoes, and in the winter adequately clothed and shod. For food they will prepare barley meal and wheat flour. They will cook it and knead it, setting out noble loaves of barley and wheat on some reeds or clean leaves. They will stretch out on rushes strewn with yew and myrtle, and feast themselves and their children. Afterwards they will drink wine and, crowned with wreaths, sing of the gods. So they will have sweet intercourse with one another, and not produce children beyond their means, keeping an eye out against poverty or war. Glaucon interrupts what Socrates is saying. Says, you seem to make these men have their feast without relishes. What you say is true, Socrates says. I forgot that they'll have relishes too. It's plain they'll have salt, olives, cheese, all these kinds of pleasures. And they will boil onions and greens, just as one gets them in the country. And to be sure, we'll set desserts before them, figs, pulse, and beans. They'll roast myrtle berries and acorns before the fire and drink in measure along with it. And so they will live out their lives in peace with health, as is likely, and at last, dying as old men, they will hand down other similar lives to their offspring. Glaucon responds, if you were providing for a city of sows, or pigs, Socrates, on what else would you fatten them than this? So, what's occurred here is Socrates says, we want to construct the ideal city in speech. Once we know what the ideal city looks like, well, the ideal city, definitionally, is going to be a just city. We're going to be able to see what justice looks like in terms of how it operates. Once we know that, then we can look at each individual in that city, and we will know what the just life is, what the nature of justice in the individual is, and we'll finally be able to determine whether justice is an intrinsic good or not, because we'll know what the nature of justice is. In constructing the city in speech, right, Socrates says, I want to make the most ideal in terms of self-sufficient, comprehensive city. But notice halfway through describing the kind of life led, Glaucon interrupts and says, well, come on, you gotta have a little desserts, a little pleasures, things like that. So Socrates is like, okay, yeah, you're right. So already the city's been altered a little bit to accommodate the kind of needs, the kind of desires that Glaucon has, the kind of pleasures he thinks are fitting for a life well led. And then, once Socrates incorporates that in and continues, it's still not good enough for Glaucon. Glaucon basically jumps into the conversation, interrupts Socrates, and says, look, I suppose men who aren't going to be wretched recline on couches and eat from tables and have relishes and desserts just like men have nowadays. So what might the city have looked like? What might justice have looked like if they stuck with this city of necessity? This city that, albeit seems to have been the kind of character that Socrates is of. Someone who doesn't require a lot of wealth, is content being poor and living on the bare minimum. Maybe the city of necessity really is just a reflection of Socrates and what he thinks is the ideal city. But for Glaucon, that's not ideal at all. He requires, when he mentions couches, right, the kind that you see in the famous, paintings and so on of men laying down, with their grapes and they talk philosophy and things like that. Pleasure. This is going to alter the direction of the dialogue, and it's going to alter the kind of city that they're going to construct in speech, taking into account these kinds of desires that Glaucon says are the kinds of things that men nowadays want. So are we a little bit less ideal? Well, Socrates actually says, he calls it the true city, and then he calls it the healthy city, is the first one, the city of necessity. Now this second city is going to be called the feverish city. The new features of this second city are going to be hunters, imitators, painters, poets, rhapsodes, actors, choral dancers, contractors, craftsmen, servants, teachers, wet nurses, governesses, beauticians, barbers, cooks, swineherds, and other domesticated animals, more land, and an army. So we'll actually see here, in trying to incorporate more desire into the city to make it, this is part of the question about what it means to be ideal. On the one hand, Socrates is saying, well, the ideal city is the one that is self-sufficient, requires the most minimal needs, and in that way is more harmonious. And Glaucon is saying, actually, the ideal city is one where there's kind of maximal pleasure. It's the kind of utopia that you think of in like science fiction when there's an abundance of resources and all our needs are met. But once we try to construct a city like that, that is when we see the origin of war and those other evils, both public and private, whether it be corruption, jealousy, and so on, arise in this city because of because of those desires that Glaucon says are necessary for human beings. The root of these evils, both public and private, it appears, is the exceeding beyond one's basic needs. But nonetheless, they continue. Why do they continue? Why doesn't Socrates argue against Glaucon? That's something to think about. Is this for a pedagogical reason? Because the city has grown so large, it's grown, in a sense, unruly. Socrates says, because it's feverish then, we have to purge the fever. So, to begin the purging of the city, Socrates says, the man who's going to be a fine and good guardian for the city, of the city for us, will in his nature be philosophic, spirited, swift, and strong. And he calls that individual, and any other individual like them, guardians. Now, how the guardians are going to be educated, and we can think back to earlier, right? What would it be like if, from youth, people were educated to think a certain way, right? The kind of sculpting of the soul. The education for the guardians consists in music for the soul and gymnastics for the bodies. So you cannot have the just city without education. In a sense, education is the founding of the just city, and you have to educate each individual for the city to be just. Why, though, does he begin with education in music for the soul rather than beginning with education for the body in gymnastics? A really important question to consider. What maybe is being privileged here in the dynamic between the two, the soul and the body? So in continuing the purging of the feverish city, Socrates says that they will have to supervise the makers of tales. So any of the poets, like Homer and so on, they're going to have to be supervised. And in fact, most of them are going to have to be thrown out. Because he says, false tales are fine as long as they lead to the good. But if people, sing tales of misdeeds that convince people that actually maybe it's good to be unjust or it's cool, that's going to corrupt the city. And those have to be banned. So here comes the creeping authoritarianism in the city. He also says, the good is not the cause of everything. The good is only of good things. Bad things are deviations from the good. And this is a look into what we'll later see in the theory of the forms. That all things that are insofar as they are particular instantiation of the good. And when we say things are bad, so like when we talk about, let's say, injustice, it's not the case that there is a being that is injustice. Injustice is just a deviation from the good. So when we talk about there being unjust people, it's not that they have taken on some qualities that are unjust, but they begin to lack the qualities of justice, such that the good can never lead to the bad, right? There's a clear metaphysical distinction that Socrates is making between the two. There is no kind of scale's not the right word. What am I thinking of right now? Spectrum, in a sense. He also says, tales of the gods must not allow them to be represented as wizards who transform themselves, nor as misleading others by lies in speech or in deed. The stories for the guardians should not make guardians afraid of dying. Instead, they should promote moderation. These stories should have the gods be heroic and pious, so they can see, the guardians, as they grow up, they can see who they want to take as their idols, who they want to try and be as close to in their actual lives. And the reason is because Socrates says, imitation, mimesis, imitation of poor behavior leads to poor behavior indeed, in action, in concrete life. So there's a clear attack on the art of imitation. Imitation involves poets, painters, sculptors, anyone who tells stories, and especially sophists. Because what is rhetoric but an imitation of logos, of speech? Socrates says, hence good speech, good harmony, good grace, and good rhythm accompany good disposition. Not the folly that we endearingly call good disposition. So we might think of, someone, I think he means it more colloquially, like we say like an athlete, they have a good disposition in what they do. But he says, but that understanding truly trained to a good and fair disposition. So that is a quick overview of the education of the guardians. That takes up a lot of Book 3. I mean, Book 3 mainly consists in that kind of an education. But then we get to the selection of the rulers. Of the ruler, Socrates says, then the man who makes the finest mixture of gymnastic with music and brings them to his soul in the most proper measure is the one of whom we would most correctly say that he is the most perfectly musical and well harmonized, far more so than of the man who tunes the strings to one another. So what's interesting about this is he says, look, we would say the one who should rule is not the one who educates, but the object that the educator has crafted. Is that true? And this will come back up actually in Book 10. The idea that the one who has the most knowledge of something has this knowledge because they use the tool, not because they make the tool. Even though you might say, yeah, but it's only possible you have the tool because of the person who knows how to make it. It's only possible that you can have the ruler because of the educator who knows how to educate the individual. Now, this is gonna, later on, we'll see kind of cause trouble for the philosopher, and the ruler will end up being a philosopher king. But the educator is the philosopher, and yet the philosopher is meant to make someone who is wise become the ruler. And what are the wise but the philosophers? And the question we'll later consider is, would the philosopher desire to rule? So basically, the rulers are going to be, of the elder population. The ruler are going to be the youth, who are then going to be educated by those who are older. And what's going to happen is the older, or who have been educated, then who know kind of what to look for based on the nature that they are, They're going to watch the youth as they grow up to determine if they are the best guardians or not, and whether they're going to be a guardian or not. So Socrates says, isn't it then truly most correct to call these men complete guardians? They can guard over enemies from without and friends from within, so that the ones will not wish to do harm, and the others will be unable to. The young, whom we were calling guardians up to now, we shall call auxiliaries, and helpers of the ruler's convictions. So now we're starting to see the class dynamic emerge in the ideal city. We're going to have complete guardians. These are going to become the rulers. And then we'll have auxiliaries. These are the kinds of guardians that are well educated, both in the soul, but also especially in gymnastics. They will become basically the soldiers, the protectors of the city. Then, to fully develop the class structure of the city, Socrates brings up what is known as the myth of the metals. And now you should already see there's been a couple myths already told in the Republic. Think about those arguments against imitation, how imitation is so dangerous. And yet Socrates continually is appealing to myths. So here he's going to appeal to what is known as the myth of the metals, and he's going to refer to it as a noble lie for the sake of the good. So a lie told because it is for the good, not of like a noble in sense of a higher class, that it's a lie that higher class individuals tell, but it's for the sake of the good. And this lie, this noble lie, is that guardians are the way they are by nature, not by education. That for the city to be just, for the inhabitants to fully comply with the principles of justice, they must believe that the guardians are the way they are by nature, not by education. Very interesting. Why? Why couldn't... Is it that they have to fully believe something is the case? Or if they believe it's by education, then they might question whether they should be good or not? So let me read the myth of the metals. Okay. So he says, I shall speak in it. I don't know what I'll use for daring speeches and telling it. And I'll attempt to persuade first the rulers and the soldiers, then the rest of the city, that the rearing and education we gave them were like dreams. So all that education of gymnastics and music for the soul and everything like that, now Socrates is saying, yes, we give that education. But for people to obey the principles of justice that upon which the just city is built, they have to believe that it was a dream, that education, that they really didn't go through that education in reality. Socrates says they only thought they were undergoing all that was happening to them, while in truth, at that time, they were under the earth within, being fashioned and reared themselves, and their arms and other tools being crafted. When the job had been completely finished, then the earth, which is their mother, sent them up. And now, as though the land they are in were a mother and nurse, they must plan for and defend it. If anyone attacks, and they must think of the other citizens as brothers and born of the earth. It wasn't, Glaucon said, for nothing that you were for so long ashamed to tell the lie. And Socrates says, it was indeed appropriate. All the same, hear out the rest of the tale. All of you in the city are certainly brothers. We shall say to them in telling the tale, but the god, in fashioning those of you who are competent to rule, mixed gold in at their birth. This is why they are most honored. In auxiliaries, silver, and iron and bronze in the farmers and the other craftsmen. So, because you're all related, although for the most part you'll produce offspring like yourselves, it sometimes happens that a silver child will be born from a golden parent, a golden child from a silver parent, and similarly all the others from each other. Hence the god commands the rulers first and foremost to be of nothing such good guardians, and to keep over nothing so careful a watch as the children, seeing which of these metals is mixed in their souls. And if a child of theirs should be born with an admixture of bronze or iron, by no manner of means are they to take pity on it, but shall assign the proper value to its nature, and thrust it out among the craftsmen or the farmers. And again, if from these men one should naturally grow who has an admixture of gold or silver, they will honor such ones and lead them up, some to the guardian group, others to the auxiliary, believing that there is an oracle that the city will be destroyed when an iron or bronze man is its guardian. So have you some device for persuading them of this tale? Not at all, Glaucon said, for these men themselves, however, for their sons and their successors, and the rest of the human beings who come afterwards. Well, even that would be good for making them care more for the city and one another, for I understand pretty much what you mean. What they end up saying is they're actually going to have to banish, they're going to have to purge anyone over roughly the age of 10 from the city in order for this to work. It's pretty dystopian. In fact, if anyone's familiar with Aldous Huxley's book Brave New World, Huxley is inspired by this idea of the myth of the metals and these different classes. How ultimately do you get the auxiliaries and the guardians to see that it is virtuous for them to protect the city no matter what and not seek their own personal gain, as so often happens in the case of military leaders and so on, where they end up thinking about their own self-interest and how they can profit? And this is the kind of communistic aspect of the Republic here, of what Socrates is going to call Callipolis, the beautiful city. For the auxiliaries and guardians, the two upper classes, or the middle and upper class, there will be no private property. There will be communal property. All their necessities, though, will be provided. Shelter, food, water will all be provided. And they will receive fixed wages. Interestingly, the workers, though, they won't have shared communal property. They will have their own private property. So it's an interesting economic dynamic for the sake of the good of the community that Socrates is advocating. But I also think it's important to consider where we've gotten to up this point. Glaucon and the others aren't yet convinced that justice is a good in itself, that the wholly just person, it's better to be the wholly just person than the wholly or perfectly unjust person, that it can be more profitable to be unjust, ultimately. In so trying to convince them, they realize, well, we have to know what the nature of justice is, or at least Glaucon says, I need to know what it is, to persuade me why I should be just, because apparently everything up till now, Glaucon hasn't really been persuaded that he should really be just. And so Socrates says, well, let's construct an ideal city in speech, see what justice looks like. And because the ideal fully just city requires all the inhabitants, the citizens of the city, to fully obey the principles of justice, we'll be able to see what a just individual looks like, what their soul looks like, and whether then the wholly just person actually is happier overall than the perfectly unjust person. And when Socrates tries to construct that original city in speech, the city of necessity, the ideal city, the true city as he calls it, the healthy city, Glaucon ends up objecting because it's not a city fit for human beings, or at least human beings as Athens, as people in Athens desire. So Glaucon begins bringing into conversation the desires that human beings have. And trying to incorporate and accommodate those desires leads the city to explode, develop a whole class system, develop a kind of extreme regulation of everything in the city, and then to convince people why they should obey their and carry out the duty of their class, they have to be told a noble lie. Why? Well, because it seems like perhaps the assumption is they wouldn't agree by nature that it is good in itself to be just, but they need to feel like it was already in their nature, even though they had to be educated to believe that it was good to be just. So what are the philosophical implications? Is this why philosophy, individuals aren't born just by nature, but it requires the development of wisdom, of what the philosopher seeks over time. It requires education.